Hey everyone, welcome to today's episode of Daily Block Party. Nisa and I are excited to have Karth Potluri. He is the CEO of a mining company. Karth, welcome and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Pam, for having me, and thank you, Nisa, as well, for having me.
So Karth, what is your background and what brought you into the crypto space and then into the mining aspect of it?
Sure. So I actually happen to run a small video game aftermarkets company around 2010, 2009, 2010, where a lot of digital games that have lots of multiplayer aspects to it. They have their own in-game currencies and in-game virtual economies. All these skins and rare items. There's a huge kind of aftermarket for them, and so we would be transacting with folks mostly using PayPal and similar tools at that time. And we ran into a problem where PayPal was having trouble enabling folks outside of North America and Europe to use their services because they couldn't really validate, who these people were, especially folks out of like Malaysia and Indonesia where our clients were. And so we came upon this concept called Bitcoin from one of our Russian customers way back then. And he was like, hey, can I buy this item using Bitcoin? And we were just like, what is that? And so we had to effectively learn everything about it at that point. None of us really knew much about it. I would honestly say that we were just a bunch of kids that were trying to, make a few dollars here and there. So it was quite different. We had to learn everything from the ground up, how to set up a wallet, how to set up the Bitcoin Core, application so that you can actually transact with Bitcoins. It was a lot of that learning experience. Really just thrown right into the meat grinder, as one of my old colleagues used to say. And yeah, from there, we just found tons and tons of, community members that were always happy to teach us about things. That's one thing I've always found to be amazing about this specific industry. Everyone's quite open-minded. The sense of community is still quite strong, even to this day, 10 years later. And yeah, from that point onwards, just focused on educating others as well in this space. Just family offices, high net worth individuals, even close family of mine. Really, anyone that wanted to learn, we would be willing to teach them. And we saw it of mining as a very unique way to get exposure to this space for folks that wanted something tangible, essentially. You can go to a traditional investor and say, hey, like, yeah, we have this computer equipment on the balance sheet. We have these power contracts available. We have these like reasonably predictable revenue models available. All of these things that were more familiar to traditional investors. We found that mining was really the closest thing we could get to have them get exposure to this asset space. Yes, that's kind of what brought me into this sector.
Okay, what is mining for viewers who don't know?
Certainly. So unlike a normal, bank and whatnot, where there is one institution that effectively accepts or denies, all transactions going through, let's say you go to Bank of America, you go to the teller, whatever you ask the teller to do, they'll send it off to a server, right? And that server will say, yes, this person has the funds, or no, this person doesn't have the funds to make that transfer, right? So you can't send $1,000 if your bank account only has $100, right? But with a decentralized system like Bitcoin, there isn't that single server saying, yes, no, you can, you can't. That doesn't exist. Rather, every single person has, their own copy of, the accounting book or the ledger, as you might call it. And so Bitcoin mining is really just a term that we use where folks that are trying to make edits to this ledger to say this person transacted with that person, anytime those entries need to be made, you have to solve a very complex puzzle effectively. And what this puzzle does is it prevents bad actors from putting in entries into the ledger that are invalid, right? It's a self moderation and it's a system that keeps itself in check and makes sure that everyone is only sending and receiving, what is correct, essentially.
Okay, and so we are 3 days away from the halving. What is the halving, and how does it affect miners?
Sure. So basically, when you solve that puzzle to write into the ledger there, you're often given a reward, for spending all of these computing power and time to solve that puzzle. There's that incentive, right? You get a reward and you get to write into the ledger. So that reward, is as part of the Bitcoin system, has over a period of, let's say, 4 years, it cuts in half that reward. And the last time this happened was 2016, roughly. And now it's been 4 years since then. So it's happening again. And effectively, it cuts the inflation rate of Bitcoin by in half every 4 years.
And how does that affect the miners?
Oof, that is a tricky question. I would say it'll depend on where you are. So the interesting thing about the mining world is there's really only 3 ways that you can differentiate yourself with anybody else: the power of the hardware that you have and just how how efficient it is, the cost of electricity that you have, and your operational costs, which would be like repairs, depreciation, staffing, all of these things. And nowadays, it's come to the point where the equipment has it's evolved to a point where it's hard to push it any further, right? 5 years ago, there would be a doubling in efficiency, every few months almost, in the equipment. But nowadays, it's taking 2-3 years, based on some predictions, to double in efficiency. So what's happening now is there's different levels of miners, and the only way that you can protect yourself is to have very, very low cost of power, right? Because you can't go out there and innovate and buy some amazingly more powerful equipment than the next person that's mining, right? So all that's left is reduce, your staffing, or make it more efficient wherever possible, and reduce your overall electricity costs. And so when you're getting half as much revenue in 3 days from now, I suppose, than you are today, that's going to be a big impact, really. So, and those miners that have very high electricity costs, or are in very expensive areas, like if you're trying to do this in San Francisco, you're probably paying your staff a lot more than the folks out in Kazakhstan or the province of Sichuan in China, where these are very, very big mining areas. Right.
So it's true that most of the mining happens in China?
I think, yeah, that's safe to say it's still the case to this day. The last report that I saw said it was about 55 to 60% of all mining happens in China. And a good chunk of that is actually in one area called the Sichuan province. I think it's about, I would say maybe the size of Texas, or just about 3/4 the size of Texas for comparison's sake. And Sichuan has an abundance of hydroelectricity, right? There's something called the Three Gorges Dam. I believe it's one of the largest hydro dams in the world. And what the governments effectively do is, when there aren't enough people or usage from industries of that electricity, they sell it to other industries at a lower rate, right? Standard market effects, supply stays consistent, but the demand is dropping off, so the price also drops off quite a bit. And that's really the reason why a lot of mining happens there. There's a ridiculous amount of energy available, and it's available for a very, very competitive price compared to anywhere else in the world.
What does your day-to-day look like? I'm curious what a mining company does, because I think still people watching this, when you say mining, you have a very different, even you did a great job of explaining the mathematical components of Bitcoin. What does a typical day look like?
Sure. So to be honest, it's quite automated. That's the beauty of mining. It's one of those industries where you don't have marketing costs. You don't really have that much staff, because it's mostly computer equipment that's handling the same process over and over and over. It's really about making sure that you wake up, you check your dashboards to make sure there's no kind of warnings or flags being put up by any of your systems. Let's say, for example, we have three rows of miners being operated. So we'll have different a different system a different part of our system for each row. And if it says, row 1, section B has 90% uptime, that means 10% of the machines are offline for some reason. So I go in there, I would have to check what's going on. Is there a wire unplugged? Is there something, was there a circuit breaker that was tripped? Little things like that. It's really just checking to see what is the reason that this equipment is offline. Sometimes it could be something as simple as dust. If you don't have a very well-designed ventilation system, sometimes dust gets in the fans and you got to clean it up. Sometimes it's too cold, sometimes it's too hot. It's very normal kind of problems that you would get with your own computer if you were leaving it outside in your backyard and just letting it kind of deal with the weather effects outside, minus the rain. Please don't get your miners wet.
So I don't know if you're aware of this, but Billions, which is a show on Showtime, this past week, season 3, episode 1 had Bitcoin mining in it, and the people who were mining got arrested in the Southern District of New York for being illegally there, and they were trying to trace it back to the main character who is a hedge fund called Axe Capital, and saying that he was invested in this mining rig. So that was huge because any kind of pop culture reference to this, got a lot of attention this week. And, the price of Bitcoin, we don't know. I mean, it's running up, it's the halving, and it could be a lot of different factors, right? There's tons of people Googling halving right now, more than they ever did before. There's a pandemic, there's all these different reasons. So, what do you think about, so there's eBang, which is going public, and there's Canaan, which is another miner that did go public that underperformed. What do you think about public equity investors having exposure through these companies?
Sure. So one thing that I need to make sure that all viewers are aware is when it comes to mining hardware and equipment manufacturers, all of that is done today in China or to a small extent in South Korea. So because of that, any of these manufacturing companies going public, you would effectively be investing, outside of North America more or less, because that's really where most of the assets are, despite the company being listed elsewhere. And when it comes to investing in these, mining hardware providers and such, it's a completely unique industry, and I would encourage anyone to learn about all aspects of mining, both on the software side and on the hardware side, so they understand every little detail that goes into it. It's like if you're going to go and invest in an oil well, you're going to want to make sure you understand the industry top down, right? That same concept I would strongly encourage for this industry. And there's a lot of secrecy as well in this industry, just because, as I said before, the equipment differences aren't really that big across the different manufacturers. They're more or less the same. So everyone's really tight-lipped about their other two. Very few people will tell you what their power cost is. So just always make sure the information that you're getting is from reliable sources as well. Yeah, it's definitely a good amount to learn, but there are so many resources out there. If you were to just Google, basics of mining or Bitcoin mining 101, and then top Bitcoin mining companies, you can kind of look into them. It's eBang, Canaan, and Bitmain are definitely the big ones. And then there's a few more common recent ones, like one called MicroBT. That one was actually built by a former Bitmain executive. So there's a lot of cross-pollination as well in the industry. So that makes it much easier.
If they're going public, don't they have to tell you their electricity costs?
So the miners are often different from the manufacturers. That's another thing, right? So those that manufacture don't always mine as much as a normal, mining specialist company. right? There's really a big difference between the operators and the manufacturers in this industry. If you want to invest in the manufacturers, that's the companies I just named: Bitmain, Ebon, Canaan, and MicroBT and such, right? And if you want to focus on the operators, you're looking at companies like Hut 8 in Canada, and then there's Bitfarms also in Canada. There's a few others. I believe Riot Blockchain now does mining as well in the United States, in New York actually. So it'll depend on which kind of the sector you want exposure to. I would say the operation side of things is probably where you'll get those disclosures about electricity rates, and whether they say it directly or not, you can usually kind of reverse calculate what their expected electricity rates are. Based on their financial disclosures.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Karth. Where can people find you? Are you on Twitter if people want to learn more or reach out to you?
Certainly, yeah. I'm on Twitter at Karth96. So happy to take any questions or comments anyone has. I'm happy to teach anyone about the space if they're interested. Feel free to reach out, and I'll help you out.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks for having me. Bye now.